In this video, we're going to be taking a look at an Android app using Kotlin in an SQL database, and we're going to be showing the data in a RecyclerView. This is not an introductory video about Android, and I assume you have some basic understanding as to how to create an app. Before we actually get going, let's take a look at that app, see what it looks like and how it's going to perform. So basically here we got the 4 input fields and we have 4 buttons. Down here in this area we actually have another text view, which I'll show in a minute. So you can either you can add data by inputting a first name, last name, and a date. You can change it using the ID number. You can delete that information from the database using an ID number, and we can show data by hitting this button. We're going to get into details here in a few minutes. So let's click on the show data button, just give you an idea. So now we're looking at the database itself and all the information in it. These numbers aren't sequential because I have been fooling around with it and I deleted a couple of the files or a couple of rows. But you can see we can scroll up and down, and again you're looking at a recycler view, and going to get into the advantages of using that and why it's suggested that we use it. So in a nutshell, that's what the app is going to look like. So we go back to Android Studio. Let's begin by creating a simple app like we normally would. I named this app MySQL database. Here we have the main activity file and the activity layout file that's automatically created. I'm going to start out by talking about the layout file for the main activity. So this layout file, it's a linear file. The orientation is vertical, and it's made up of 4 edit text fields for the ID, first name, last name, and the date. That's shown up here, and then the next linear layout is for the buttons. Again, we have 4 buttons down here for what we're trying to do. And again, note the ID number is button add, button change, button delete, and button show. And then we have one more text view down here at the bottom. It's hard to see, but this is going to show the results of clicking on these buttons. This is what we're looking at in this linear layout, showing the 4 input fields, 4 buttons, and then the text view. That's about it. So now we're going to take a look at the main activity file. It's pretty much a standard file. The onCreate method associates the layout that we just talked about. Here I set the onClick listeners for the 4 buttons, and here's the associated methods that get called when you click on the button. So now we're going to take a look at these methods that get called. If you look at them real quick, they start out with the same format. First we're going to talk to the database, and then we're going to do a little bit of maintenance work. That's pretty much the format for the first couple of methods here. What we first do is to define some variables. Then we're going to call an SQL database a method, insert data, and these are the arguments that it takes. And that's actually going to insert the data into the database. We're going to be using this database helper, which we're going to talk about a little bit later on. Then we have to clear the fields. There's a method down here which basically wipes out the information in the edit text fields. If we look at our application, these fields here, after we fill them in and hit the add data button, we need to clear them out to get ready for the next set of data. So that's what this method here is doing. And also after we clear the information out, we also add this text field, which tells us or confirms that the function has completed. Change data, again the format's the same. You add some variables, We use an SQL command change data, and again, we're going to be using this data helper class to do that. The delete method is pretty much the same. Show all data is a little bit different. I'm not going to say too much about it right now, but when you hit the show data button, what we're going to do is we're going to create an intent, and that intent will start this recycler activity. So I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail, but that's it for right now. So you can see the main file is rather simple. It's pretty short and straightforward, and that's really how you would expect it to be. So before we begin talking about the SQL database, we have to get a little background information. SQL stands for Structured Query Language, and a database consists of nothing more than a table or a group of tables containing the information you're working with. Before you start this project, you want to have a good, clear understanding of what your particular table is going to look like. Typically, you could think of a table as nothing more than an Excel spreadsheet. So it consists of nothing more than columns and rows. I created a few here in a Word document just to give you an idea what they can look like. So I have a weather table, a balloon table, and a people table. And you can see they're just consist of columns and rows. One row of data defines one set of data. And in SQL tables, there's something very important, and that's called a primary key. So within a table, you have to define which column is going to be your primary key within that table. Primary key is unique to that table, and again, it defines one row of data. When we create the table, we will tell the software what column is the primary key, and at the same time, we will have the software auto-generate that number for us. So if we take a look at our app, if we input data into the database, you notice there's no ID number here in that field. When we add data, it's going to auto-generate, fill that in for us, and it added a row number 31. And so we see down here row 31 has been added, and that 31 is the primary key, and it's been auto-generated. Let's look closely at this table, the people info table, because this is the table that we're really going to be using in our app. So again, it consists of the 4 columns, and this ID column will be the primary key. So what we need to do now is to tell the software what that table is going to look like. And before we do that, we need to create a package to keep this organized and clean. We're going to create a package. I called it a model package, and inside that package we will define the tables. So let's start by making the package. You just right click, go to new package, and then within that package you want to create a class, or in object-oriented programming we're going to want to create an object, a people object. In this application, the only table we're really using is the people, the balloon, and the weather is just there for information purposes. So we want to create a class, just like we always would. Kotlin file class, and it's going to be called people. If we take a look at that people class, this is going to define what the people is made up of. And as we just talked about over here, a person is made up of an ID, a first name, a last name, and a date. Those are the 4 variables that make up a people, and they're all of type string. So that's how you create a people object. Associated with this people object is a layout file, and that layout file is named layout list people. So you're going to have to create that. Right click on layout, go to new resources, layout resource file, and create a new layout file. Let's take a look at the layout file. So again, this layout file is associated with this people object, and it's going to show how we present the information of a people person. So there's your ID number, that's your first name, that's your last name, and that's the date. So this is how the information will be presented to the user, and it's nothing more than 4 text fields, pretty straightforward. Note the ID within the text field. There's a people last name, there's a people first name, there's a people date, that sort of thing. I also just want to point out there's a little space between each of those text views. That's what this view widget does. So again, this layout file is associated with the people object, and it's how it's going to get how the people object will be presented to the user. So now we're going to begin talking about the SQL database itself and how to use it. Let's just clean up a little bit here. So we as developers could actually deal directly with the database using commands from the Android SQL package, but that gets a little messy and it's complicated. So it's recommended we use a library called the Room Persistent Library. Here's the URL for that, and I will include it in the link below. This library it's like a layer or interface between us and the database, and it'll make interaction a lot easier if we use this. To use it, we have to add the support library to the dependency section of our build Gradle file. So make a copy of this, open up build Gradle, and paste it in. Be sure and sync it when you're finished. There is an Android developer webpage that will tell us more about this SQL database, so I encourage you to read through it. But one of the first things it says is that we have to create the schema or contract, and that's nothing more than a formal way to identify what the database is going to look like. So in it we have to identify the table name, the column names, and that sort of thing. It's pretty much everything we talked about before in terms of columns within the database. So one of the first things we have to do is create this Kotlin file. I call it a DB contract. And if we look at that, we see it's pretty straightforward and identifies the table name and then all the columns within that table. And that's really all there is to that. Android has an SQLite open helper class that has a useful set of APIs for managing the database. So now we will create a class defined database helper. And to do that, you just go click here, you right click, new Kotlin, and this will be a class, and I named it database helper. So this is going to be a SQLite open helper class. That's why we extend it by that class. And it's shown here in the in the Android Studio developers webpage. So within that class, one of the first things you're going to want to do is create what's called these companion objects. In Java, we could define static variables and static methods, but in Kotlin you can't do that. So by defining these companion objects, we can share them or access them easily throughout our project. So that's the first thing we're going to do, is create these variables. And you note that they are using that DB contract, which we defined over here, that object. It's being used here in the helper class to again define what our table name is and our column names are. There's also a couple variables in here in the companion object, SQL create database and SQL delete entries. This, as you might expect, will actually create the database, and this is going to delete entries. If you just note here within this variable, we give it a table name, the field names, and within that first field column, the ID column, we define it as primary key. I talked about that before. We're defining the first column, the ID column, as the primary key. We're also defining it as auto increment, so that when we run our app, we're inputting new data, this ID field will be created automatically. We just have to put in first name, last name, and the date. So in the onCreate method, we see that we have a variable DB. It's a type SQLite database. So that's the first thing we're going to do on the onCreate method, is create a database. There's a couple other functions in here, upgrade and downgrade, which are in the Android Studio's developers web page. The upgrade and downgrade, and I just copied them from there. We don't use them in our application, but they're required fields. So now I'm going to talk briefly about the next 4 functions. Each one of these functions again is associated with clicking the button. So add data, we're going to insert data, and we're going to talk about functions for each of these other 3 buttons as well. But you hit the add button and you're going to insert data into the database. And if you look at the Android developer web page, they have sections for each one of those. Here's where we're putting information into the database. That's what we're doing over here. Insert data. First thing we do, create a variable, which is actually a database, and it's going to allow us to either write to the database or read from the database. It does both, so that's a nice version of the variable to create, because it can do both read and write. So we're going to create that, and then what we do is we create some variables that we're going to be using, and when we're inputting data into the database, the arguments here tell you that we need a first name, last name, and date. So we create those variables. Again, we're using this DB contract object to create those variables. Then this is the helper class command that actually inserts the data into the database. Just one line that gives the table name that we're using and the information which we're going to be inputting into the database. It's a one simple line command, and it returns a long object. That's what this function is going to return, a long object, which happens to be the row number that the data is inserted. So back at our application, last time we inputted data and it was row number 29. That's what this function is going to return. We're now looking at change data. Change data function is going to take an argument of type people. It's going to return an integer. And again, we create this variable, which is allows us to write to the database or read from the database. Some variables that we need to interact. We're talking about people objects, so it's the ID, first name, last name, and date fields. Down here it's a little bit different because we're talking about changing data. The way you change data, it's based upon the ID number. So when you're changing data, you put an ID number in here telling the software what row of data you're going to change. So this is getting that ID column to figure out what row is going to be changing, and then it gets all the information on that row, and then it actually updates that row of information with this one simple command line, and it returns an integer. When you delete, it's pretty much the same. You delete based upon the column ID number, and the SQL command is simply delete based upon the table name and the column ID, and it returns an integer as well. Read data gets to be a little bit more complicated, but it's not too bad. So when you hit the button show data, this is the function that's going to get called within your database helper class, and you actually first create a variable, which is an array list of people. Then you create that the variable which you can read or write to your database, and then it's going to actually select all the information in this one particular table. So it's going to go through all the rows and all the columns, and it's going to select all that information. And then down here you define all the variables, and here it's going through two loops, one loop with inside it's another loop. So it's going to go through all the columns left to right. That's one loop. For each of the rows, one row at a time. And what it's going to be doing is putting all that information into our database variable, which again is an array list of the people object, and then it's going to return that array list of people objects to the method that called it. So hopefully you follow all that, and that pretty much ends our conversation on this database helper class. So let's go back to the main activity file and take a look at the show all data function. Let's close this out. So this function looks a little bit different to some of the other methods. In this method, we're going to create an intent that will start a new activity, recycler activity. You can use intents for a number of different reasons, but in our case, we're going to use it to start another activity. Here's the Android developer's webpage that talks about starting activities and using intents. So you can take a look at that. Let's now look at our app so we all know exactly what we're trying to do. So when you hit the show data button, what we're trying to do is present to the user all the data that is in our database. And to do that, we're going to use a recycler view. Here's the Android developer webpage that talks about a recycler view. And as it says here, if you want to display a large set of scrolling data based upon a large data set, you should use a recycler view. So that's what we're going to do. The biggest advantage to a recycler view is that it's very memory efficient. It only holds in memory that data that is currently presented to the user. So only this data, which we see here, is kept in memory. And when you scroll that old data is removed from memory, and again, just the information you currently see is held in memory. So that's what makes it so efficient. So one of the first things it says here we need to do if we're going to use a RecyclerView is to add the support libraries. So we want to go to the build Gradle file and add the support libraries for the RecyclerView, and then be sure to sync it. So let's take a look at this recycler activity file. It's an activity file, so what we need to do is go up here, right click, new activity, empty activity, and again I called it the recycler activity. Notice associated with it is a layout file which I called activity recycler. So once this new activity is created, I want to quickly check your Android manifest file. That's over here. We'll open it up. The Android manifest file, I just want to make sure that the new activity, recycler activity, is recorded there. So associated with this activity is this layout file. Let's take a look at that. So we're going to present the data to the viewer by using a RecyclerView, and this layout is going to use a RecyclerView widget to present that information to the user, and this gives you an idea of what it's going to look like. So it's going to present it one row at a time. In our case, each row is going to consist of 4 columns, but again, this is nothing more than just a RecyclerView widget, and that's basically it to the layout file. So now we need to go back to this recycler activity file, and we see in the first line we create a variable of type recycler adapter people, this file here. So we have to talk about this file, and we also have to talk about what's called a RecyclerView adapter. Views of our array list are going to be presented by view holder objects. In our case, each view holder object is responsible for displaying one row of data. This view holder object are managed by what's called an adapter, and this adapter will create the view holders as required based upon the number of rows we are trying to present, and it will also bind the view holder to the data displayed by our RecyclerView. So we need to create this file. It's just a normal Kotlin class file. So we right click, new Kotlin file. It's a type class. This class is going to extend the RecyclerView adapter class, and it's of type view holder. Next, we want to create the view holder class extending the RecyclerView view holder class, and that is responsible for holding each view of each individual list items. Inside the view holder, we want to identify all the items that we're going to be showing in the view, or in other words, each row, the ID, first name, last name, and the date. These variables come from the layout shown in the layout list people. Next, we have a method that will bind or connect the layout I just talked about with the view. For the onCreate view holder method, we can follow the Android development page. In the onCreate view holder method, we can create view holders that reference the layout list people file and return a view holder. The onBind view holder method will replace the contents of the view based upon the row position in the database. The method is called for each row of data in our array list. Here, you can set the attributes to view holder object. It's a little confusing, but a good thing about the adapter is they are pretty much the same from one project to the next. So I'm just going to go ahead with this code. You can see in the Android developer webpage, it talks about the onView holder. We never use the next method, get item count, but it's required to have it in an adapter class. So that's why it's here. And our last method, submit list, takes an argument. It's an array list of people. And this is how we're going to get our data into the adapter object. That covers the RecyclerView adapter. So let's go back to the recycler activity file and finish looking at that. Just a reminder, this activity is only used when we hit the show data button, and its sole purpose is to present the data in a recycler view. So in the first two lines, we create two variables. The first one is of type recycler adapter people. That's this file over here, which we talked about. And the second is of type database helper. That's this over here, which we talked about a few minutes earlier. In the onCreate method, we set the layout to the activity recycler. That's this down here. We then have a init recycler method. That's this here. And here we set up the recycler view shown in the layout associated with this activity. We identify a layout manager. We next have a space decoration object, which is going to separate the rows of data. We then initialize the adapter variable, and finally we set the RecyclerView adapter to our adapter, people adapter. In the last line here, submit list, when you click on the data show data button, the database helper object returns an array list, which is given to the adapter and is shown in the recycler view. So that's basically everything. And when it all comes together, here's what our app looks like. I'm going to input some data. We just inputted row number 32. That's our 32 is our primary key. It's auto-generated. I'm going to show the data. We're now looking at the data in the recycler view. It's very memory efficient when we scroll through it. There's row number 32 that we just added. We're now going to delete row 29, AA, using our primary key, 29, delete data. Data has been deleted. We're going to show the data. Scroll through it. Row 29 is deleted. So that's the end of the video. Hope you found it informative, and please leave your comments below.